Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Kalamea.
And I'm Amy Gosha.
Welcome to the Divorce at Altitude, a podcast on Colorado family law.
Divorce is not easy. It really sucks. Trust me, I know. Besides being an experienced divorce attorney, I'm also a divorce client.
Whether you are someone considering divorce or a fellow family law attorney, listen in for weekly tips and insight into topics related to divorce, co-parenting, and separation in Colorado. Welcome to another episode of Divorce at Altitude. I'm Ryan Kalamea. I'm joined by my co-host, Amy Gosha. Amy, what's new?
Not much. Just, like Eric, he just found out that he's going to get a divorce. And so this podcast, we're going to be talking about kind of him coming into the office for the first time.
Yeah, last time we spoke with Jim Bailey in Denver about attacking premarital agreements, and he referenced that first meeting is always a triage. So we thought it would be helpful to go over the most frequently asked questions that we as divorce lawyers get in that initial consultation. So I'm going to be taking more of a standpoint of Eric and asking Amy you, and then also commenting on the questions from Eric's standpoint. So the first question that every time we have a consultation, it inevitably comes out is, does the reason for the divorce, does it matter?
Right. And so I think that's probably every single client's question, especially, Eric. The reason in Colorado, it's a no-fault state, so it doesn't technically matter. However, as the attorney, I want to know why Eric is getting a divorce so I can understand what, driving it. Also, there is a concept in Colorado called marital waste, which we'll probably talk about further down the road. But in general, it really does not matter.
Right. And we kind of referenced in our first story, the story of Eric Wolff, and he says that they essentially are having a race to the bottom. And we sometimes see that where he is spending a bunch, going on heli trips with his boys. To what extent that is dissipation or marital waste, we can get into it. But, their marriage has been dead for quite a while. That is apparent. But I think it's fair to say, Amy, would you agree that anytime there's a perspective by both spouses that the other person was the cause for the deterioration of their marriage and having an affair, we see that or hear that all the time, and people want to have their day in court. What if Eric, he says, I was sleeping on the couch and that Melanie would go to bed and there was just clearly no love there? If he had been having an affair, how do you think that would have mattered, or how would you have counseled Eric in that circumstance?
Well, if he had had an affair, essentially, my question would be, has this person had any contact with his kids? And, in this case, I don't think that she has, but it could definitely come into, the best interest factors when looking at, parenting time. I would probably tell him to kind of cool off, take a cooling off period to just not make it so complicated, because when you're going through a divorce, it's highly emotional. Dealing with a new relationship just can make it even more emotional. So as much as I could, I would tell Eric, try to lay off as much as you can on that new relationship.
Yeah. And if Melanie, certainly we've represented a number of Melanie's people, assuming that Eric had an affair, where they want to have their day in court. They want to blast it out to the newspapers. They want to tell the judge about the mistress. And they think oftentimes if they can just tell the judge their story, that they'll understand. And one thing that I will tell them is you need to be careful of biting the hand that feeds you. If that affair comes out in a courtroom, the court record, it can be a public document, and going to coworkers, sometimes affairs or those sorts of things come out in the workplace. That can be very detrimental, and it could end up harming someone like Melanie. But we frequently do see that where they feel somehow they have a negotiating advantage by virtue of what happened in their marriage. So for me, it comes out and it's helpful because it drives the atmosphere, the emotional atmosphere and climate for any sort of settlement negotiations. But ultimately, I always tell people the judge does not want to hear about it. And if there is dissipation, if there is marital waste, it's a challenge, but that is one aspect that is probably an exception, except for maybe when it involves the kids, right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, that's the main concern in representing Eric I would have is that I want to make sure that he's, a stable parent, he's providing what he needs for his kids and not just focusing on his relationship or putting that his new relationship and putting that first before the kids.
Now, the second question, and just for a reminder, Eric Wolff's story, it's posted on our website. It was featured in our first story or first episode rather. But Eric, he goes out after the counselor's office in which Melanie says, I've hired a divorce attorney. And he goes out skiing and really kind of releases his kind of his pent up emotions. And he says to himself that he's really scared and he knows he's in a bad situation. So being a savvy business guy, one thing that he's going to ask is our second question, which is, does it matter who files first? Melanie hired the divorce lawyer first. It really bothers him. Does that matter? And does it matter, Amy, who files first?
I mean, it only is going to matter who files first if you're dealing with like jurisdictional issues, which we'll get in later, which means, living in separate states. So it really doesn't matter, in Colorado who files first. I get a lot of questions. I'm sure Eric would ask me as well, like, does it matter if I'm the first one to file? Like, should I be the petitioner who's the person that files or if that makes a difference? And in my perspective, doesn't. What is your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I think an old school approach would say it does matter because, the petitioner, they get the kind of first opportunity to present the evidence and then rebuttal. I was a prosecutor back in the day and I loved rebuttal on closing arguments. So anyone that you would say, oh, you get an opportunity to make your opening statement, and then you get rebuttal. And the petitioner does that. And I know that there was one divorce lawyer that I used to work with, but he has since retired. He felt very strongly about filing first. I think that what you're touching on is that the benefit of filing first, the way that you start the proceedings can really drive the overall trajectory of the case. If one person strategically files, that there's this gamesmanship. Whereas if people file jointly, it starts off the case on the right foot. I always say to people, listen, I could have the other party filed or served rather by a biker in leather at 2 a.m. That will certainly get their attention. And it's not as if we've ever done that, but it more serves for that. If you really want to upset someone and send a signal, you can do that, but it's not necessarily the signal that I want to be a part of or that I want to send in cases that I'm involved with.
Yeah, usually I would probably advise Eric that if he files first, that we would give Melanie's attorney, a call to see first if they want to file jointly, or if not, if he will sign she will sign what's called a waiver of service. It just creates more of an amicable, collaborative approach than not.
Right. And they're in the counselor's office. She says she's hired a divorce lawyer. One would hope that they could figure out a way to file jointly or cooperatively. And in our next episode, we'll talk about the pre-filing considerations and go over those sorts of factors that we as divorce lawyers frequently will cover. But the third question that we always get is whenever there's kids involved and you hear Eric is worried about his kids, how is this going to impact the kids? And as a dad, we frequently get questions about, we had this certain paradigm where I went to work and the mom took care of the kids and things are changing now. So how is custody decided in Colorado? And everyone uses custody, that word in their consultations. And how do you get a parenting plan? How is that even figured out to the extent that even someone like Eric knows what a quote unquote parenting plan is? So Amy, how is custody decided in Colorado?
So what I first would talk to Eric about is that in Colorado, we don't really use the term custody. We use allocation of parental responsibilities. And part of that is parenting time, which is like the physical time that he would have with his kids, and then decision making, which is the major decisions made for his children, which would be medical, school, extracurricular activities, those types of things. So, I talk about it in, 2 separate sections. And, before kind of getting into how parenting time is determined, which is in the best interest of the children, I really, I want to know from Eric, what his children are like. Do they have special needs? Like, do they, participate, expert skiing, like what are their interests? I'll talk to Eric about what is his work schedule, because a lot of times the parenting plan will be determined on just what are people, what is their schedules. If you have, for instance, if Eric is, working overnight, that's a consideration when you're determining what the parenting schedule should look like. The short answer is, in Colorado, it's based off of the best interests of the children. And there's certain factors that the court looks at. And I usually will highlight putting the needs of the children before the parent, and then effectuating the relationship of the children with the other parent as being really, really big factors that the court really looks at. So it's what's in the best interest of the children, but, that's kind of nebulous, like it comes down to what are the kids' needs, what are the parents' schedules, where are they going to be living, so those are considerations that we talk about.
Right. In Eric's story, he references that he's concerned about the number of wine bottles that he sees in the garage when he leaves. And presumably Melanie, will get into some of these issues, but Melanie might have a drinking problem, but he hasn't been proactive with the children. And that may have been a result because of the tension at the household. And there could be a number of other factors. But I think, at least in my observation in the last 10 years, there's certainly been a trend more towards equal parenting time by judges. And I think that the pandemic has even magnified that effect, because it used to be that the father would go to work. If in a traditional standpoint relationship, the dad would go to work, he'd come home and, he'd live in Boulder and then work in Denver, or vice versa. And then you'd have that commute. Right now, people are working from home and they're at home more and more. And certainly I have seen that in the cases that I've handled, where even just recently in Aspen, where the judge noted that the father was essentially working at home. And I think that there has been a general trend. It's not by law, but I think most judges would admit that their kind of starting point, obviously it's going to depend on the kids, but the starting point is equal parenting time unless there's some other consideration. And it's kind of an unwritten rule amongst the bench. At least that's been my observation. And that's really hard to tell someone like Melanie. Whereas Eric, we can't obviously guarantee that he's going to get equal parenting time. It's really going to depend on his interest level. What does he want to do with the kids, and what does he think is best for the kids? But do you have any comments on that, Amy?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that the trend in Colorado, and it's very different than some other states, that it's definitely more of a 50-50 starting place. And I think that that's, something that Eric probably is going to like to hear, is that, that is a starting place. And I think that trend also has to do with also just both parents usually working. That's kind of more of the trend now. So I think that's also part of it.
And going back to the decision making, a lot of people will talk about legal custody, and that's decision making. And when you hear their story about working in a counselor's office, I think the same thing goes for the equal parenting time as decision making, and that is that the default is joint. There needs to be domestic violence or just a complete inability for people to not agree. And even in that circumstance, there's other options such as a parenting coordinator, decision maker. And essentially, we're going to go over in upcoming episodes and really take a deeper look at some of these issues, decision making, parenting coordinators, and the ways that we can resolve some of these issues for someone like Eric. But we actually have a blog post. It's one of the most popular blog posts that we've ever done. And it was written, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And the American Bar Association confirmed that Colorado is one of the most progressive for fathers when it comes to parenting responsibilities, whereas another place like Tennessee, it has a much more traditional standpoint amongst the bench. So that's something that I would certainly share with Eric. Let's move on to the fourth question. Eric is going to ask, he's texting his buddies, or he's thinking about texting his college buddies and, from college. And, one of his old frat brothers might just say, when are you going to start dating? When are you going to get out there, man? So if Eric asked you, Amy, When can I start dating? What's your response?
My response is that, I don't want it to be a distraction to him during the divorce process, especially, if it can affect the children. So if he, introduces any people that he's dating, or if he is out and about and drinking, staying out late, that can affect ultimately his time with his kids. So not that dating is something that you're prohibited from doing, but I would just advise him to really think hard about that and how it would affect, his case, his energy, his well-being, and his parenting time with his children.
Yeah, in the story, Eric and Melanie, I mean, it's not obvious, but frequently, Amy, we hear, I haven't had sex with my significant other for 2 years or 3 years. And I always tell people, especially someone like Eric, you can date. There's nothing legally prohibited. You're not legally prohibited from doing it, but it goes back to why you're getting a divorce, and that it can really emotionally cause some issues. But at the same time, divorce is extremely stressful, and you have to release the tension and do what makes you happy. And that can be skiing, it can be yoga, it can be in a counseling situation. Some people can drink, certainly, but if you find someone that you can share that's going to make you happy, use your judgment and be discreet, because the amount of money that you spend, the introduction of them to your children, that can just blow the lid. I had a case once where the husband went out to the favorite restaurant and brought his new girlfriend there. And it caused so many problems that it just was not worth it. So I have a real conversation about, hey, listen, I understand that you need a distraction, that you want to maybe start anew, that you've been unhappy for a really long time and you don't want to be alone. But at the same time, you need to balance that by by using your judgment and common sense.
Yeah. So specifically what I would tell Eric is, he likes to really ski with the boys. Like, I would just tell him, like, take up more skiing, get out there, like get your reset.
One of my favorite clients of all time, he set a goal of doing the Highlands Bowl 100 times. And so every day he was out there, and it was one of the most healthy outlets that I can think of. I've had other people that get really into yoga, but it's something that it just is unavoidable, is that mental component. Let's move on. And the other question that we always get is, how do we decide who gets what in terms of property? And Eric might say, Amy, well, the house is in my name. Does that matter? We hear that all the time. So what's your response to the house being only in his name? And how do we decide who gets what? He owns a business. So what happens?
Yeah. So I'll give you, like a classic lawyer answer. It depends. So it's going to depend. Where I start is, I explained to Eric, that separate property is, what you had prior to marriage, and there's caveats, and we'll get into that in further episodes. And then during the marriage, it's property that was acquired during the marriage. And then there's an increase in separate property during the marriage, can also be marital property. So I get an idea as to what the property is. And so the name, if the marital residence was purchased during the marriage, it's just in his name, then it's not. It's marital property. Where it really is going to make a difference is if he owned that property prior to marriage, then, that does make a difference. So I think a lot of times people think, well, just if it's in my own name, then that just means it's mine. And that's not the case, as we know. So with the business, same thing. If he started his business prior to marriage, there might be a separate property component to it. But if, if it was just started during the marriage, then the entire business is going to be marital property.
Right. The way that I describe it, oftentimes in that first consultation, when I am talking, and no one has ever accused me of not wanting to talk. And as Jim Bailey said, I'd share, his sentiment that I love to hear myself talk. It's one of the reasons we started this podcast. But the consultation, that first consultation, I am really focused on just trying to listen and hear their concerns, hear Eric's story, and really get to know them. But when it is time for me to explain the process, as we're doing here in part, is I explain it that there's the Eric and Melanie basket, and you have all your property in that basket. And the process of divorce is that you have your own Melanie basket and Eric basket. And then when you put in the business into his basket, that's going to weigh it down. And then, it's not a guarantee that she's going to get the house, but there needs to be, or there should be, some sort of offset, so that it's really hard if you have two assets, the main two assets in the marriage, and it's the business and the house. It's really hard to conceptualize that for Eric getting both the house and the business. And so there's a allocation, and that's one of the roles that we play, but we don't know the value of the business. Oftentimes we have to figure out what that is. And same thing with real estate. And when you come in and they say, well, I've got 100 shares of Apple stock, well, that we have a known amount that we can tell you that's what the Apple stock, because it's publicly traded. Cryptocurrency or Tesla stock, or certainly a partnership or some sort of business interest, that's when we can't tell you at the very beginning what it's worth. And Eric's story and concerns are certainly well-founded. There's not going to be any divorce lawyer that's going to tell him exactly who's going to get what and how it's all going to sort out. And, I'm sure Eric kind of strikes me as the guy that comes in with like a spreadsheet and says, this is what's going to happen. We've all had those clients. Or, the flip side is, oh, it shouldn't be that hard. We should just be able to figure this all out really easy in like just an hour or so, right? We've all had those Eric clients.
Yeah. Also, what I would explain to Eric is that I think a lot of people think that everything is just divided equally, or maybe in his mind, if he's, really put in the sweat equity to his business, he might think that that's separate and not considered. That in Colorado, property is divided equitably. We're not a community property state. Normally it's equal marital property division, but I do make it clear that there is some leeway there. And so it's not just, like you said, straightforward and something that you can figure out in an hour when you have a business.
Right. I mean, it kind of as part of that, most clients will come in and say it's divided equally, right? Like it's by law that you divide it equally. And as much as we can look at equal parenting time. Yeah, I think most judges, but you have to know the judge. I mean, there's certainly judges that I appear in front of that will take a very different approach, or they really will look at the contributions. And certainly when you're talking about millions and millions of dollars, and in the case of Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, I think, his wife got several $billions reportedly, but then he ended up with many, many, many billions of dollars. And that was a disproportionate allocation. So it really depends on the facts and circumstances of the case. And, certainly I've been involved in those cases where, one party gets 60%, but it completely depends. And going back to the title, that can matter if there's a separate property and tracing component, which again, we'll address at a later episode, but those are always the questions that we get. So related to that and, about who's going to get the house. Eric is always going to come in and say, well, should I move out? What should I do? Should we, she told me, Melanie said, I hired a divorce lawyer. Is she going to change the locks? Well, how do we tell the kids? What should we do? So Amy, walk us through what your advice would be to Eric if he was asking you about, should I move out?
Yeah. So and especially like a dad, usually when the dad comes to me, they are, especially if they're the worker, like they're concerned that they should never leave the house because they're concerned it's going to affect their parenting time. So I think there is also kind of a misnomer out there that, I need to stay in here until we figure everything out. And so it can affect, parenting time, but at the same time, like nesting in Colorado is not an ideal situation for any family, even when you're going through the divorce process. So I would talk to Eric about like, what other options do we have? Like, do you guys have another property? Do you have another property that's, I don't know, like a condo in town that you could go to? Does it have enough rooms for the children? So we look at that an option first. Second option is doing kind of a nesting arrangement, which means both parents staying in the house were actually rotating into the house during their parenting time with the kids. But frankly, a lot of people don't have the money to like move out right away. So there is kind of that interim period. And so we try to figure out, okay, I'm like, Eric, you've been sleeping on the couch for a long time. I don't want you having to sleep on the couch, but, can you, is there a finished basement? Can you at least be down there and Melanie can be upstairs? So to have some kind of structure until we can figure out when he's able, to move out.
Yeah, the two biggest factors from my perspective on whether or not someone should or shouldn't move out is one is is there a risk of parental relocation? That in my mind can really drive whether someone should or shouldn't move out. If there's going to be a significant risk, if the relocating party is if they're going to be leaving and trying to take the kids. That is something I always ask. It's not something that clients or prospective clients or anyone in a consultation, they usually don't bring that up. And if they do, then it's a big issue and we'll get into that. But aside from that, the financial aspects, if people are living paycheck to paycheck and, people that earn millions of dollars, they can be living paycheck to paycheck. They just have a lifestyle that is kind of attendant to that. Up here in Aspen, especially this upcoming summer, the rental rates are crazy. And so when you inflict a divorce on a financial situation that is tight, Eric is annoyed with his wife buying handbags. He's still going heli skiing, but there might have to cut down on that. The reality is that divorce, there's transaction costs, and you go from one household and one cable bill. If they haven't cut the cord, Eric strikes me as a kind of a cut the cord type guy, but you have, instead of one utility bill, you now have two, and all of that adds up, and it can be very difficult for people to manage that. And when you have those living costs, that can really be a factor. But when people are in the same household, there's a risk of incident with domestic violence or the police getting called, and it can just be really tense, and that's not necessarily good. And quite frankly, it's inevitable. Like they're going to have to split, whether they sell the house. Those are kind of the factors that at least I really focus on.
Yeah. I would ask Eric, that's a really good point about, does he think that there's any risk, for there being an altercation where the police get called? Especially in this circumstance where Melanie's probably really mad that he's having affairs. And an affair.
Right. If that's what's going on, but it could be just a maintaining the status quo. He's been living out on the couch. They might be able to just make that happen and transition. It really depends on the facts and circumstances. Amy, that brings us to our last question with Eric Wolff. He is always going to ask at the end, how much and for how long am I going to have to pay alimony to Melanie? I do not want to write a check for her. Tell me the situation is on alimony.
So what I would tell Eric is that the first thing the court is going to look at is how to divide property. So, that's the first thing. The court is really going to try to minimize Eric paying alimony, which is a really, probably good thing for him. However, in Colorado, we do have an advisory formula, and it's for a combined gross income of $240,000. And if you make over $240,000, which I assume Eric does, I haven't seen his tax return, but knowing that he's a successful business owner, then this advisory guideline doesn't apply in Colorado. And the court has to make certain findings first in order to award Melanie spousal maintenance. And some of those factors will be, what are her needs? If Eric came out of school and had a ton of student loans, we're going to have to look at, does he have the ability to even pay spousal maintenance? I'm going to look at, like his business and the other, assets to see, can we alleviate the need for spousal maintenance? So those are the types of factors, not just slam dunk, you're not going to pay any alimony, but there are a lot of factors that go into whether or not he is going to be required to pay spousal maintenance.
Yeah, we've talked about some trends here on this episode. There used to be that a traditional paradigm was that the mom got full custody and that father or husband was going to be paying alimony for the rest of his natural born life. And everyone's heard those horror stories. I think the general trend is as more fathers have been given or presumed to have more responsibility, there's been more responsibility that women have had if they're traditionally the recipient of alimony, but that both people are expected to work. I've seen judges, in particular female judges, it come down pretty hard on parties, women that are staying at home, and they say, listen, I've gotten up and worked and I'm a judge, I'm a successful judge, and you can too, not necessarily become a judge, but that they can work. So I think that those traditional paradigms have been shifting, in particular in the last probably year, because you're going to have this issue of, can Eric even pay maintenance or alimony? But obviously it depends on what amount of money Melanie would get in any divorce. If they have $20 million and there's rental properties, or there's a municipal bond or equities, stocks and bonds that is transferred to her after the divorce, and she can go and invest that money and earn income, that's going to be a factor. And the judges, I think, I've heard panels of judges talk about the way that they handle or analyze maintenance. And I think that they're always looking for ways to avoid it. There can be future modifications. Generally judges don't like that. So they'd rather give a spouse more property to alleviate the need or mitigate the maintenance factor. And so those are the sorts of things that we would really have to dig in. And certainly we're going to have a whole episode on maintenance and alimony, into taking into consideration all those different things. It's not something that you can really get into in depth in just an initial consultation. So to wrap things up, Amy, what are the kind of takeaways in a consultation with you for Eric Wolff? What are the things that you're kind of leaving him to walk away to ponder in a consultation?
Well, hopefully I've alleviated some of his fear. When he came off that ski slope, he just was really scared, not sure what his future holds. Is he going to get time with his kids? I mean, it's super personal and it's hard. Money is super emotional, kids are emotional. And so hopefully I've given him just a foundation for, here's what we can do moving forward. So that's always my goal, is to have him leave feeling a little bit better and having more direction.
Yeah, Amy, I mean, you had a consultation on your divorce. So do you think that helps you? And is that something that you think about when you go through these consultations now?
Yeah, absolutely. Because even as a divorce attorney, practicing for, 13 years now, I hired my own divorce attorney because it's just a hard time. It's a major life change, and you might not be thinking, how you normally would, because it's stressful. So you really, in my situation, I needed that support and that buffer. And it felt very good to have someone in my corner. So I want Eric to know that I'm in his corner.
One of the things that I have observed is that just that release of tension, and that people feel like they have a plan, even if I haven't laid it out in complete detail. And the way that I explain it is that it's kind of like climbing a mountain. We come up with a game plan, we gather up information, we sit down at the table when you can do that, when it's safe to do that. You get out the map and you figure out what the plan is. And then you try to execute that plan, try to get the case settled. And then if you can't, then you might have to litigate. And meanwhile, you're always trying to settle that case, but there's a information gathering stage. And when they see that that there's light at the end of the tunnel, or there's, that mountain in front of them, and you lay out, this is the trail that you're going to go on, the relief that they feel, and, to kind of allay or address their worst fears, is something that is really rewarding, at least for me. And from my perspective, I always try to gather what their expectations are. And frequently what I will do is ask them what they expect from me. And I'll say, if you hire me and I could wave a magic wand, I can't go back and repair your marriage, Eric. I can't make go all away, but what is it that you want? And then I get an idea of what their expectations are. And I really try to drill down on the priorities, because you can't always get what you want. I mean, we heard that Rolling Stone song, he's playing the air guitar, but it really is, you can't always get what you want in a divorce. We try to figure out what are the top things that you want and what is it that you need. But frequently people will say, I want X, Y, and Z, and then we'll obtain that in a settlement. But oftentimes people will say, well, I just want more. And it's because it's just part of the process. And I have to remind them of what they told me in that initial consultation. And that really is how I try to kind of wrap things up, and still a sense of confidence and opportunity and positivity. It's going to be difficult, but I'm going to be there for them. And I can't promise them anything other than I'm going to be there in their corner, and they'll be able to tell me their kind of deepest and darkest secrets. And I want to know them, because I don't want to go to court if we have to go to court and be surprised. And so that is usually what I end with, is that sense of purpose and sense of transition in their lives, and that I'm there to help them through that.
Agreed. And also just to give Eric a sense of what is a reasonable expectation, as much as possible.
Well, we're going to be covering all these issues in depth over the coming months, and we appreciate everyone listening. If you haven't, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. We've already received some great reviews. We'll read some of those on our next episode, but please tell a friend if you enjoyed this podcast. And thanks for listening to Divorce at Altitude. Hey everyone, this is Ryan again. Thank you for joining us on Divorce at Altitude. If you found our tips, insight, or discussion helpful, please tell a friend about this podcast. For show notes, additional resources, or links mentioned on today's episode, visit divorceataltitude.com. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen in. Many of our episodes are also posted on YouTube. You can also find Amy and me at kalamaya.law or 970-315-2365. That's KALAMAYA.law.